right, so now to introduce the women of the hour, Lillian Gundip and Anne Dulian. Lillian and Anne lived almost parallel to each other as women from immigrant families in the Pacific Northwest at the very start of the 20th century. Born 9 years apart in 1900 and 1909, both women belonged to marginalized communities that were discriminated against, with Lillian of Chinese descent and Anne of Jewish descent. Before passing, they donated cherished belongings to MOHAI's collection, and as is the case with many artifacts, little is known about the owner's story or the context behind the items themselves. Many influential people in history have written records documenting their stories, notable events, or even personal musings at various points in their lives. However, like many of us, these two women lived their lives and influenced their surroundings through interactions and by making choices one day at a time. Unlike, let's say, Lillian's father or Anne's late husbands, all of whom were wealthy and successful men of their time, these women don't have books that document their lives or successes. I've pieced together information from a number of sources to gain insight into what their experiences might have been like, starting wide with historical context and narrowing in on any content I could find in newspaper clippings, articles that reference them, or obituaries. As researchers, museum visitors, or curious individuals, we are often presented with narratives from the perspective of the victors, the wealthy, and the powerful. We have the difficult task of trying to untangle what information is biased or representative of the few rather than the many, and are left with blank pages when searching for stories from the perspective of the minority. This makes patching together a narrative for those with unrecorded stories impossible at times, with their existence referenced in the shadow of a big event, if that. What I'm presenting today is the information I found through research and insight I could pose through context. The stories of these women and the historical information will blur together and overlap, but my hope is that the combination of both interweaving sources can help us fill in the gaps of their untold narratives. I'll begin with Lillian. Lillian was born in Portland, Oregon in 1900 and was one of 4 children. Her father, Gundip, and mother, Chinyuk Nui, immigrated from the village of Sunggok in the Guangdong province in China during a tumultuous time for Chinese immigrants in the US. Her father, Gundip, was a prominent businessman and was the Chinese consul for Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. As context, in Chinese custom, you have a family name first and given name second, so Gun was his family name and Dip was his given name. Contrary to these customs and unique amongst her siblings, Lillian took her father's full name, making her Lillian Gun Dip rather than Lillian Gun. This was because it was impossible for her to get credit under the name Gun alone, but Gundip was a well enough known name in the area. When Lillian was 9, Gundip purchased the Milwaukee Hotel located at 7th Avenue and King Street in Seattle. Prior to the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, Chinatown sat on stilts over tidal flats in a small, crowded section of what is now Pioneer Square. Gundip had an influential role in establishing Chinatown through the investment in Chinese-built structures and businesses in the regraded area it is currently established. The uprooted Chinese community relocated to the new Chinatown and were restricted access to other areas of residence. The Gun family occupied the top floor of the Milwaukee Hotel until Gundip's passing in 1933. At the age of 24, Lillian graduated from the University of Washington, go Huskies, with a degree in education. Sadly, she was never able to teach in Seattle due to the prejudice against the Chinese. Restricted but driven, Lillian was very devoted to her hobbies. Lillian was active in Seattle Ballet and performed with Mary Ann Wells School of Dance. From what I could deduce, Lillian was the only person of color in the school. Despite the hostile discrimination experienced by Chinese immigrants at this time, Lillian chose to perform in traditional Chinese theatrical costumes and robes. The robes and headdress in this photo, are on display here today. In contrast to the other dancers in leotards and Eurocentric costumes, Lillian's bright robes and headdress would have been novel and eye-catching when juxtaposed with her peers. When Lillian was 27 years old, her school performed at Seattle's Metropolitan Theater for their 11th annual dance festival. Lillian performed as a jester, a tree, and a leading role as an opium poppy pistol in a show titled Chinese Dream. The poem given to describe this performance goes as follows, quote, "Alas, opium, I love your dreams of the flowering poppy, I am your slave," end quote. Whether intentional or not, Lillian performed in roles that I perceived as what was fitting for an outsider. Her father's influence in community and wealth would surely have given her opportunities that other immigrants might not have had access to at that time. However, this was a time when Chinese immigrants were directly targeted and excluded through legislation and discriminated against in the public sphere, so her father's influence could not change the fact that she was different and likely treated as such. In addition to dance, Lillian was an accomplished horseback rider. At the age of 39, Lillian moved to Mercer Island, but continued to ride at Jimmy Rainwater's Riding Academy in North Seattle. In a stroke of bad luck, Lillian, at 41 years of age, struck her head after a fall from a polo pony that caused a skull fracture, leaving her in a coma for 2 months. Her specialty nurse at Swedish Hospital, Lavina Stockwell, cared for her during this time. Hope that she would ever regain consciousness was dwindling when Lavina, through constant daily interactions, noticed Lillian give a faint smile at one of her jokes. Motivated by the breakthrough, she pushed forward and encouraged Lillian to respond verbally, to which Lillian started her long journey back to recovery with a faint, uh-huh. Lillian and Lavina became lifelong friends from here onward, with Lavina caring for Lillian and her mother, Mrs. Goon, at their waterfront home on Mercer Island. Though born in America, Lillian had undergone the traditional practice of foot binding as a young child. This created additional complications as her recovery had her bedridden for so long that her Achilles tendons had seized and required surgery for her to walk again. Unfortunately for Mrs. Goon, a broken hip and lost use for previously bound feet forced her to occupy a wheelchair for 5 years before her death in 1946. Lillian continued to live life her way, much to the chagrin of male relatives who felt that a proper Chinese lady should be seen and not heard. She was proud, spirited, independent, and with a wicked sense of humor, and loved animals without limits. She considered herself the local humane society, taking in strays and owning as many as 40 cats and dogs at one time. At the age of 69, Lillian and Lavina's beloved dog, Mac, who she named after her uncle, disappeared from their home. Both women were older in age and could not physically search for him, but they called shelters and neighbors fervently. Their relentless detective work paid off when they learned from a neighbor that the Humane Society had picked him up when he first went missing, and a man in Snohomish adopted him 4 days later. They learned that this man had a large property and accepted that Mac would be happier on a large plot of land to run around on. They were not given access to the man's contact information, but wanted desperately to reach him by any means necessary. Lillian posted copies of this story in all the papers read in Snohomish County in the hopes that Mac's new owner would contact her. She was not attempting to have Mac returned and didn't want to visit as it might cause him trauma to watch her leave. The reason Lillian tried so desperately to connect with Mac's new owner was so she could tell him Mac's name, as she was worried learning a new name in his older age would confuse him and didn't want her long-loved pup to struggle. Lillian passed away at the age of 75 in a Mercer Island nursing home. If this collection of anecdotes tells us anything, it is that Lillian was an incredibly tenacious, driven, and brave woman with a huge capacity for love. She suffered a lifetime of rejection, pain, and loss, but rather than fester in negativity, she fostered her interests and shared her wealth of compassion with those around her. Now we will transition over to Anne Dulian. Anne, originally Anna Fabrikant, was born in Poland in 1909. Her father, Benjamin Fabrikant, and her mother, Hilda Sukenik, immigrated with 2 young children to New York City in 1911. From 1880 to 1924, the Great Wave brought 2.5 million European Jews to New York, 75% of whom settled in the Lower East Side, or the southeastern part of Manhattan. By 1920, the Jewish population reached 1.5 million and rose to 1.9 million by 1940. Like many other Polish immigrants, Anne grew up in Manhattan, though little is known about how she spent her early years. Sometime in her early 20s, Anne was hired as an assistant to 37-year-old business magnate Louis Dulian. Louis traveled extensively for his different business ventures, but kept an office in New York City as an operations hub and hired assistants whenever he was back in New York. From Lewis's perspective, he hired girls every time he was in town for a few months at a time before jetting off. But one day, he hired Anne and quote-unquote kept her, and eventually married her. Despite their problematic power dynamic, it was clear in an interview recording of Lewis's career and trajectory that Anne was not afraid to be vocal. She inserted on several occasions that he hasn't mentioned her or his family yet when listing his successes, and that she did not live with him until they were married. You go, girl. The focus on Anne continued for only a moment longer when the interviewer commented on her accent and asked if she was English or Eastern. Lewis quickly responded that she is from the East Coast. She's from New York. Whether it was to distance her from an immigrant status or to clarify where she considers home, it is safe to assume that Anne's Polish heritage was not a valuable thing to mention in this interview. Despite these assumptions, Lewis made clear that they never experienced anti-Semitism in their life or business, despite their devout practice and involvement in the Jewish community throughout their lives. Unfortunately, I do not have Anne's personal account on the matter. 2 years after their marriage, they moved to Seattle for a business opportunity. They raised their 2 children in Seattle, with their daughter Merle, born in 1935, and their son Frederick, born 2 years later. Together, they were members of Temple de Hirsch Sinai, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the Scottish Rite Temple, the Nile Temple, Elks Lodge No. 90, and the Glendale Country Club. They were well known in the Seattle community for 3 main things: their wealth, their parties, and their philanthropy. To understand a bit more about how they obtained their wealth, I will give a quick background on Louis Julian's portfolio. Lewis's parents were born and married in Latvia, moved over to the US right before his birth in 1895. They were divorced a few years later, and his mother moved to Seattle and remarried, bringing the children with her. Lewis's mother passed away about 10 years later, leaving Lewis with his uncle. Feeling unchallenged and restless, Lewis dropped out of grammar school and started working for his uncle at the age of 12 at Alaska Junk Company. By the time he was 20, he worked as a manager outfitting Alaska gold rushers. He also traveled the country looking for deals, purchasing and liquidating sawmills, old mines, and surplus materials in Alaska after the gold rush. Due to disagreements on the management of the company, Lewis left his stocks and shares in the company and established a business in his own name in Seattle in the early 20s. Lewis was completely broke, but he had good credit with the Seattle First National Bank and was very familiar with the bankers from years of handling the Alaska Junk Company finances. Through a substantial loan, Lewis is able to rent a yard in Georgetown and operated from there until purchasing a yard in Marginal Way during World War II. In 1923, Lewis drove across the country to New York, with the journey taking a full month. He was visiting Navy yards all across the East Coast to buy surplus materials from World War I to process and liquidate for profit. This trend continued with liquidations of power plants, shipyards, and sections of railroads after World War II. He even purchased and liquidated the contents from the San Francisco World Fair, Treasure Island and all. The U.S. Navy pushed to retain the palaces of Treasure Island for the war effort against Japan, which he reluctantly sold for $125,000, which was nearly 10 times less than what he wanted to sell it for. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Lewis really liked liquidating stuff. If you're like me and your first thought when hearing about old money is, how much is that worth now? Let me tell you. $125,000 in 1940 is worth just over $2.75 million today, and that was just for a few palaces on Treasure Island. Lewis's processing yard, Dulian Steel Inc., continued to process, store, and sell scrap metal, especially iron, with the market particularly high in exports to Japan and the domestic steel mills in the Pacific Coast. He had previously worked in exporting materials to Japan when managing at Alaska Junk Company, so travel and export to Japan was a familiar part of business. Though he had employed many managers in the past, the only business partner he ever had was Anne. There are records of them traveling together to Japan regularly for business ventures. Together, they were real estate moguls, socialites, and philanthropists. I found countless articles in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer describing cocktail parties, fundraisers, or dinner dance extravaganzas that Anne hosted seamlessly and were apparently newsprint-worthy. As a wealthy socialite with a number of causes that interested her, Anne was an active member of local civic organizations such as the Seattle Boys Club and the Foundation for the Preservation of the Governor's Mansion in Olympia. In a newsprint from 1953, Lewis and Anne hosted a buffet fundraiser in their home to raise money for the Museum of History and Industry, which had just opened its doors to the public in 1952. Anne's interest in museums didn't stop there. She was very interested in the arts, particularly the Asian arts, and was a regent member of the Seattle Art Museum. She was a collector of Chinese and Japanese art and clothing, which she likely purchased while on one of her many trips to Japan. Fascination with the East, or the quote-unquote Orient, as it was once called, has been a part of Western culture since the late 13th century, when Marco Polo brought the first marvels of China to the West. Fashion in the West was forever reshaped by the exposure to the exotic textiles and patterns of the East. Despite the overwhelming resentment in the US towards the Chinese in the 19th and 20th centuries and the Japanese during the Second World War, the fashion and art from these cultures transcended language barriers, and the foreignness of these items were forgivable when the people were not. To quote a book titled Orientalism, Visions of the East in Western Dress, quote, "To wear Chinese dress at home was not a frivolous and fanciful gesture. It was an imperial act signifying worldly knowledge," end quote. With the increased trade routes between Seattle and the East in the early 20th century, access to the exotic was more reasonably attainable by those who could afford it. Considering the prevalence of collected curiosities and exoticism amongst the wealthy in this time period, it is easy to picture Anne hosting one of her many cocktail parties while draped in her white and gold kimono, which she owns. Anne's interest in fashion extends beyond the Eastern exotic. As was fashionable after World War II, luxurious, expressive, and feminine clothing were back in. Many women lost their jobs when the men returned after the war, so uniforms and overalls were reminders of hard times. Dressing up was back in style. Additionally, the United States emerged from the war with the booming economy and strengthened ability to produce goods. The ration restrictions of the war were gone, and consumerism was in full swing. I'm not sure what Anne's extended wardrobe looked like, but the couture dresses, imported pumps, and ornate accessories that she donated to MOHAI offer us a glimpse into the high fashion taste and tiny waistline that Anne must have had to possess these. We've discussed Anne's hosting abilities without focusing on the philanthropic work involved. Cocktail parties and dinners, like the ones I previously mentioned, were warmly hosted with the main objective of fundraising for various charitable organizations. Among the many recipients of these fundraising efforts was the Children's Orthopedic Hospital and later in life, the Swedish Hospital Medical Center. In addition to the fundraising efforts, Anne was a leader in the Seattle chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women. The NCJW was founded in 1893, and in its early years, it pushed to strengthen Jewish homes by combating assimilation and by educating women about Judaism. Their efforts expanded into politics, focusing on immigrant aid, combating anti-Semitism, and protecting reproductive rights, to name a few. In 1979, Anne's husband, Louis, died at the age of 83 in Honolulu, where he had gone to recover from an illness. Anne was remarried in 1981 to Joseph Diamond, the parking lot titan whose parking lots are perhaps begrudgingly familiar to many of us. Aside from their shared practice of Judaism and their wealth independent of each other, Anne and Joe had quite a bit in common. Joe's parents fled Ukraine due to the anti-Semitic rule of the Russian Tsar, so they share a very similar immigration experience. He was also recently widowed after the death of his wife of 47 years, which, much like the devastating loss Anne experienced when her husband of 46 years passed away. Sadly, that's better. Sadly, only 3 years passed when Anne died of cancer at the age of 74. Much as she lived in her passing, she found the time to think of charity. She bequeathed $1 million to the Swedish Hospital Medical Center for the construction of a cancer treatment wing and for cancer medical research. The main general cancer treatment floor at Swedish was named the Anne Doolian Wing. Anne was survived by her second husband, Joseph Diamond, her children, and 6 grandchildren. Her memorial service was held at the Temple de Hirsch Sinai, and she was buried next to Louis at the Hills of Eternity Reform Cemetery in Seattle. Based on these excerpts and stories, one could gather that Anne was extremely energetic, consistently devout in her culture and community, and fiercely driven. I believe Anne did not receive enough credit for her intelligence or her contributions to her family and community, which is sadly the case for many women throughout history. To better understand the lives of these women, I will share some historical and supporting context that will help paint a full picture of what their experiences might have been like. For example, a crucial part of Lillian's backstory is the political and racial obstacles her family struggled through and the influential role her father, Gundip, had in the Pacific Northwest despite that. Gundip was one of many Chinese immigrants from the famine-stricken Guangdong province that came to the U.S. in search of prosperity during the gold rush of the 1800s. Before statehood, many Chinese immigrants fled to Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia after the initial lure of gold in California led them northwest in search of golden rivers. Although the influx of workers was a benefit to the developing railroads, moods began to shift to anti-Chinese sentiment in areas where railroads were nearing completion. Following the miners northwest, Chinese contract workers and merchants followed suit, and by 1880, there were over 3,000 Chinese immigrants in Washington state alone, a significant leap from the 234 just 10 years prior. When the railroads were built and the gold ran out, thousands of Chinese men joined the job market as cooks, domestic servants, cannery workers, coal miners, and other forms of laborers. The Long Depression lasted from 1873 to 1879, with adverse economic struggles remaining after a long time after. The competition for jobs exacerbated resentment towards the Chinese, and violence was soon to follow. Gundip first attempted to immigrate to the U.S. when he was 14 years old in 1876, but due to concerns of safety, he returned to China after a few years. While in China, Gundip married Qinyuk Nui, who, like her husband, also had family ties that settled in the Pacific Northwest. Gundip decided to return sometime before 1882 and wept at the enormity of his undertaking. To his great fortune, he caught the attention of Ella McBride, a girl his own age who showed him compassion and sympathy. Ella was able to convince her parents to hire Gundip as a houseboy in Portland, assisted him in learning the English language, and helped him adapt to U.S. customs. They became close friends, and Gundip later named one of his daughters after her. Shortly after his arrival, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed. Though there were discriminatory taxes and prohibitions against Chinese immigrants prior to the act, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first national immigration restriction aimed at one ethnic group. Despite being previously welcomed as cheap labor for the railway developments and cannery industry, anti-Chinese agitators grew progressively more and more angry that legislation did not stop Chinese immigrants from coming into the country illegally and adding to the unemployment problem. First sparked in Rock Springs, Wyoming, on September 4, 1885, anti-Chinese agitators murdered 11 Chinese workers and drove out 500 more. The next day, Chinese hop pickers in Issaquah Valley near Seattle were shot under the cover of darkness. Even when brought to trial, anti-Chinese sentiment was so prevalent that the shooters were not convicted for their crimes. Hostility towards Chinese immigrants continued to grow throughout the country, and within a few months, the Chinese were violently expelled from both Tacoma and Seattle. The mayor of Tacoma at the time, Jacob Weisbach, deemed the Chinese a quote-unquote curse and a filthy horde, calling mass meetings to, quote, consider the Chinese question. The Chinese community was given the deadline of November 1st to leave the city. On the rainy 2 days to follow, an angry mob kicked down the doors of Chinese civilians, threatening them at gunpoint. Many cried and pleaded for more time, but were chased out, losing their homes and possessions. They were forced to purchase train tickets out of the city or board a freight train if they couldn't afford it, with what they had on them, losing everything but their lives. All of Tacoma's 350 Chinese residents were driven out. 3 months later, violence broke out in Seattle as a mob started to forcibly expel the city's Chinese population. By this point, more than half of the Chinese who lived in Seattle left on their own over the last year, with the remaining 300 to 400 in the city struggling to find employment. Despite the reduced numbers, many felt a forceful resolution was necessary and gathered together in meetings to devise a plan. Several groups of men were accompanied by members of the Seattle police force to create a militia, forcing frightened Chinese residents from their homes and accusing them of violating Seattle's lodging ordinance. More than 300 Chinese residents were taken to the docks with their belongings to board a steamer, but with a limited capacity on board the ship, the Home Guard decided to lead the remaining Chinese residents back to Chinatown, where most of their homes were already destroyed. The mob of several thousand outnumbered the officers, and they demanded the expulsion to continue. Violence ensued, and the officers created a small ring around the remaining 100 Chinese patrons who, at the sound of gunshots around them, threw their packs on the ground and lay face down on the street. The standoff lasted between 30 and 45 minutes, with many from the mob wounded and one dead. Governor Squire proclaimed martial law, and the president ordered U.S. troops to Seattle to bring the city back to order. Tension settled as another 110 Chinese were taken away by boat, with only a few dozen remaining. Seattle's Chinese population had a slow and painful recovery, taking over 20 years to return to its 1885 levels. At the same time, the city's Caucasian population increased more than tenfold to well over 100,000. As temperatures subsided, the Chinese gradually moved back to Seattle. However, very few returned to Tacoma, and the community that once existed was entirely lost. With the new laws in place, including restrictions prohibiting Chinese women from settling, with the exception of wives of merchants and prominent businessmen, the Chinese population dwindled and grew older. With his excellent English and business savvy, Gundip was employed by a labor contractor and eventually launched a garment industry in Portland by teaching disabled Chinese men who could not perform manual labor how to sew. As a prominent businessman, Gundip was able to bring Chinyuk Nui to the States, where they had and raised their 5 children, Martha, Ella, Daniel, Rosalind, and Lillian. After opening and selling a few successful dry goods stores in Portland, Gundip and his business partner bought the Oregon Hotel to house visitors to the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland in 1905. Gundip started expanding his business ventures to Seattle, where his wife's relative, Chin Ji-hee, had become a wealthy and prominent labor contractor and businessman. With Chin Ji-hee returning to China in 1905, Gundip became the most influential Chinese figure in the Pacific Northwest. Gundip was appointed the honorary consul by the Chinese government for Washington State's First World Fair, the 1909 Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle. After the AYP Expo, he was named the permanent consul and served in that position until his death. In addition to the many accomplishments I've already mentioned, Gundip also became the largest single employer of Chinese labor in the Northwest as the labor contractor for one of the biggest salmon cannery operations in the world. He was the only contractor to hire black cannery workers. He contributed to the Alaska economy so much through gold mining that a mountain and river were named after him, and was honored for his philanthropy, often financing an entire college education. Gundip passed away in 1933 and is buried in the family lot in Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle. In 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed with the passage of the Magnuson Act, permitting a quota of 105 Chinese immigrants annually. After 61 years, the contributing factors that led to the repeal included the quieted anti-Chinese sentiment in the U.S., the distaste for the rapid increase of immigration from various nationalities, and China's allyship in World War II. The internment of Japanese Americans obliterated the once vibrant Japantown during World War II, leaving a mix of decimated Asian communities in Seattle's Chinatown. In 1951, city officials decided to rename the neighborhood as the International District to reflect the mix of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino citizens. The Chinese community markedly changed as a result of the quota being instated, the removal of restrictions on women emigrating from China, and the permission of Chinese workers to enter fields that were previously closed to them, such as medicine, engineering, corporate business, and even politics. In 1962, Wing Luke was elected to the Seattle City Council, becoming the first Chinese American on the U.S. mainland to hold such a post. In 1965, anti-Asian bias in U.S. immigration law was eliminated. This sweeping reform prompted a new tide of immigration from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China. Between 1979 and the 1990s, Washington State's Chinese population more than doubled. In 1993, Tacoma City Council passed a resolution to make amends and to apologize for the former city leaders' actions. The city of Seattle followed many years later in 2015, with a resolution expressing regret for the anti-Chinese legislation in previous Seattle City Councils, recognizing the past and continuing contributions of the Chinese to Seattle and reaffirming the city's commitment to the civil rights of all people. It's astonishing to think about the atrocities suffered by the Chinese community right here in Seattle over the last few centuries. I can only imagine what it must have felt like for Lillian to be raised in such hostile and oppressive times, only to witness transformative legislation corrections in her 40s up until her passing in 1975. It is important to learn from history and to see these fear-based atrocities as the folly of man rather than a symptom of time. Similarly, such cruelty and prejudice has affected the Jewish community all over the world in more instances than I have time to cover in this presentation. I will give some background on historic events that are related to Anne Doolian. From 1880 to the 1910s, approximately 2.5 million Jews emigrated from Eastern Europe in response to pogroms in the Russian Empire, most of whom immigrated to the United States. These pogroms were large-scale, targeted, and repeated anti-Jewish rioting that began to occur in the 19th century after Imperial Russia acquired territories with large Jewish populations from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Ottoman Empire. In 1881, the assassination of Tsar Alexander II sparked the pogroms, with the anti-Semitic beliefs of some infecting the Russian press and spreading the baseless conspiracy that the Jews committed the act. The use of the term pogrom became common in the English language after a large-scale wave of anti-Jewish riots swept through present-day Ukraine and Poland from 1881 to 1882, with over 200 anti-Jewish events occurring throughout the Russian Empire. Jews were reluctantly permitted to live in small territories that were designated, quote, the Pale of Settlement, by the Imperial Russian government. During these pogroms, thousands of Jewish homes were destroyed and many families were reduced to poverty. The new Tsar Alexander III blamed revolutionaries and the Jews themselves for the riots, and in 1882 he issued the May Laws, a series of harsh restrictions on Jews that removed their access to home ownership, restricted movement to rural villages, made transacting business on Sundays illegal, banned participation in local elections, and limited admittance to school using quotas. Initially intended to be enacted under temporary measures, the May Laws remained in effect for over 30 years. The pogroms and the tacit support of them from authorities led many Russian Jews to reassess their status in the Russian Empire, leading to the large-scale emigration. Jewish prominence in the Pacific Northwest started in Portland, Oregon, in the 1800s and spread to Seattle, beginning with a little-known Jewish furrier named Bettman, who settled in Seattle in 1855. The Schwabacher brothers, Abraham, Lewis, and Sigmund, established their historic store, Schwabacher & Bros, in Seattle in 1869, which developed into a wholesale business that served the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. In 1869, Seattle had a population of 1,107 people, with only 2 Jewish families in the city, the Schwabachers and the Kaufmans. As we discussed previously, Seattle's population, particularly the Caucasian population, boomed exponentially in the late 19th and early 20th century. World War I intensified the trend toward centralization, and with the closing of trade routes to Europe, American capital was being invested in the East Indies and Eastern Asian countries, or the Orient. World War II brought hundreds of millions of dollars of federal funds to the Puget Sound area for airplane and ship construction industries. The war had a positive effect on population numbers in King County, with the population of Seattle increasing by around 120,000 between 1940 and 1943. Other significant contributors were the establishment of industry and infrastructure in the city, the Northern Pacific Railway and local transport advancements, and the massive city developments and expansions that occurred after the Great Fire of 1889. A handful of Jewish residents met in 1889 for the first official religious gathering in the city, celebrating the High Holy Days in the back of Jacob Alpern's food store. As the community grew, gatherings began to occur in rented spaces using member contributions and religious traditions were being practiced in groups more and more. Bailey Gatzer, a relative of the Schwabachers and the first president of their company, became the first and to date only Jewish mayor of Seattle in 1875, and was one of the founders and first president of the Puget Sound National Bank. Nathan Eckstein, Gatzer's successor as president of Schwabachers, was a member and president of the Seattle School Board for years and was rated Seattle's most useful citizen in 1926. Though few in numbers, the Jewish community was making a big impression and creating a strong presence in Seattle. In 1891, Bikur Kolim, an Orthodox synagogue, was founded and established with the purpose of caring for the sick and providing proper burial. Within a decade, it evolved into a religious congregation. In 1899, 70 Jewish families came together to found the Temple de Hirsch, a temple that still exists today and now boasts over 1,500 member families. The various Jewish communities address the needs of new immigrant populations from Poland, Russia, Turkey, and the Isle of Rhodes that were pouring into the region. Several religious institutions sprang up in the city, for the most part in 1 or 2 square mile area in the Central District. Significant events of the 20th century, such as the ensuing Great Depression, near annihilation of European Jewry, and the creation of modern Jewish state of Israel, changed Jewish communities in Seattle and across North America. In 1928, different Jewish groups joined together to form the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, or the Seattle Jewish Fund. It was the first centralized Jewish umbrella institution with a communal approach to raising funds and allocating them towards rescue, relief, and other philanthropic efforts. The Federation faced difficulty during the Great Depression and had to pause its fundraising efforts, but the news of the devastation caused by the Holocaust triggered a wave of movement. By 1945, the Seattle Federated Jewish Fund raised $164,000 and another $390,000 the following year to rescue, rehabilitate, and resettle the survivors of the Holocaust. The name of the federation went through several changes, with the most recent change in 1973 to the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle. This name change represents the growth and spread of the community out of the central area to the suburbs of the Greater Seattle area. Prior to this spread, racial segregation in the housing market through covenants and policies restricted Black and Jewish residents to buying and renting homes in the Central District. This anchored minority communities to the Central District at various points in time. Between 1890 and World War I, the Central District was a predominantly Jewish community due to the centralization of Jewish institutions in the area. After the spread of some of those institutions out to suburban areas and a major influx of African Americans during World War II, the community then became the center of the local civil rights movement. Around this time, Jewish communities began to move towards Seward Park and to the east side. By 1969, Seattle was home to one of the largest Sephardic communities in the state. The Jewish community, including Sephardic, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform branches, rapidly grew in numbers, and by the early 70s, the Seattle Jewish community grew to about 11,000 residents. As of 2020, Seattle was considered the 15th largest Jewish-populated metropolitan city in the United States. Though it is easy to consider Ann Doolin's journey as fortunate and prosperous when looking at the sparkly headlines and couture gowns, it is important to state that it was not without adversity. Anne escaped one home where she didn't belong, only to be despised in the place where she sought asylum. The undue struggles experienced, the sacrifices made, and the hate-based cruelty suffered by her ancestors, her family, and her community cannot be marginalized in the light of success. Okay, well, I'll just do like a little shake. Okay. All right. Now, it's been like an hour and 15 minutes, and we're only just getting to the artifacts. I promise we won't be here all night. I would like to very briefly describe each of these artifacts to tie them into the ongoing narrative, starting with Ann Doolin's Easter hat in the top right corner. Worn for a photo shoot with the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, this cream-colored, white-brimmed Easter hat is made from Milan straw and trimmed with black chiffon and lace. Sadly, I could not find the Seattle PI article to offer context for this image, as it quite possibly never made it through to print. The reason I chose to include this hat in this presentation is purely because of what the hat means within the context of the image. The Easter hat or Easter bonnet originates from European tradition in Christian countries and gained popularity in the US in the 19th century. It was worn to celebrate the oncoming spring with Easter as a seasonal marker. In the high society crowd that Ann Doolin would have been mingling with, it is more likely than not that the majority celebrated these types of traditions. When I see Anne wearing this hat, I see a woman blending in and using fashion to do so. This might be for her own feelings of comfort and belonging, but I think it is equally as likely that it is to make those around her more comfortable by surrounding them with what they already know. On the bottom right is a blue accordion pleated cocktail dress that belonged to Anne. That's beautifully on the right there. This high fashion strapless dress is made of embroidered net with a 2-tiered skirt and blue lace draped over the front. It was designed in Paris by Jean Desaix, a leading fashion designer from the 40s to 60s. Born in Egypt to Greek parents, Desaix specialized in creating draped evening gowns that were inspired by early Greek and Egyptian robes. His style and fashion grew very popular amongst European royalty and celebrities, with Valentino working under him for several years in the 50s. Much like the exoticism previously described in the fashion industry, Desaix was able to transcend borders through fashion. This dress is yet another example of acceptable cultural exchange without the burden of bearing the whole culture. Anne's beige silk pumps on the bottom right corner of the slide were designed by the Italian designer René Mancini, made for the French fashion house Givenchy, and purchased at a boutique in New York. These heels are circa 1970, meaning that Anne's tiny feet first wore these silk and rhinestone heels when she was visiting New York in her 60s. It's difficult to say why she was in New York at this time. Perhaps it was to visit one of her 2 younger brothers, Bernard or William Fabricant. Perhaps it was to go to a wedding or for a shopping trip. I think the main takeaway here is that Anne cared so much about being fashionable that she wore heels in her 60s. I'm wearing heels and I've been standing for an hour and my feet are numb. We will now move on to Lillian's side of the slide, starting with Lillian's colorful and ornate headdress on the top left corner. Lillian's family is from the Guangdong province, formerly Canton, in the southeastern region of China. The most popular theatrical genre of the area is Yuezhu, or Cantonese opera. Yuezhu operas include music, singing, martial arts, acrobatics, and theater. These performances include background stories that range in subjects, from historical events to heroic epics. Costumes are bright and vibrant, much like the very playful and bold headdress on display here today. The headdress is very light and full of movement, with the many pom-poms and beaded lines made with metal springs and tassels, loosely swaying with every movement. The movement of this headdress would complement and accentuate the amount of movement in a Yuezhu performance. The bright colors and reflective beads and baubles would add to the very bold costumes and makeup that the characters would perform in. Adorned in the top center of the headdress is the Shao character, which is a symbol of longevity. The use of kingfisher feathers to create an iridescent blue sheen, or the art of Tiansu, was used to inlay the Shao symbol, as well as the adornment surrounding the frame of the headdress. The feathers weren't the only animal product used in the making of this headdress. The pom-poms were made with animal hair of some kind and likely dyed into the very brilliant colors you see today. It is difficult to date this headdress. However, it can be noted that there are silver baubles missing on the headdress, as well as in the image of Lillian wearing it in the 1920s. If Lillian inherited this or it was older than purchased, it would likely be from the late 19th century. Moving on to Lillian's theatrical robe in the bottom left corner, traditional Yuezhu costumes were made of silks and satins of bright colors. Colors held symbolic meaning, with red representing respect. The roles of opera characters held a lot of importance on the types of costumes worn, with characters falling into unique categories such as military man, main female, scholar, and clown, to name a few. The female characters of Yuezhu were often differentiated as either a woman or a young woman, with the types of characters completely different depending on the type of opera. The 2 types of Cantonese operas are mun, meaning intellectual, polite, and cultured, and mo, meaning action-packed and often using weapons. In a mun performance, there are soft, slow movements with more drama in the story. Performers tend to show off their abilities in water sleeve movements, which are sweeping plumes created by the manipulation of extended sleeves of the actor's robe. In a mo performance, the costumes are very complicated and heavy, with movements more intricately choreographed. Based on the size of Lillian's robes and the general context, it is safe to assume that her theatrical robe was intended for a young female performer. As her robe does not include water sleeves and her sleeves and pant legs flare out at the cuff, it could indicate that these robes were intended for a more acrobatic performance type, like those described in the mo performances. Of Lillian's artifacts, we finish with the modified lotus shoes on the bottom left of the slide. As previously mentioned, both Lillian and her mother went through the foot binding process that was traditional in wealthy Chinese households. It is difficult to say whose shoes these originally belonged to. However, based on the images of Lillian posing with her feet in the shot, I am willing to bet that her feet were not bound to quite the extent her mother's were, and it is very unlikely these shoes fit Lillian's feet when she was an adult. It is also possible that these lotus shoes belonged to Lillian at a younger age or were inherited from her mother. There are multiple possibilities, and they all involve these shoes and a lot of discomfort. Speaking of discomfort, bound feet were called lotuses and were ranked from iron to gold based on foot size. For context, gold lotuses measured under 10 centimeters or 3.94 inches. I looked it up, and a standard credit card is 3.5 inches. Think about it. 4-inch golden lotus shoes were specially made and worn for more than 1,000 years until 1911, when the imperial feudal system collapsed and women didn't have to bind their feet anymore. Some women still chose to wear them, however, the shoes eventually lost their market, and foot binding as a practice gradually decreased in popularity. These lotus shoes are made from silk and are delicately embroidered. The back was cut and modified using the addition of denim and printed flannel to potentially make it larger. The incomplete stitchwork on the back of the denim implies it was done by either Lillian or her mother, perhaps as a crafting project. Whether the denim loops in the extended back was to add comfort for the wearer or to craft together materials from two different cultures as a project, these lotus shoes are a very symbolic representation of Lillian and her family's assimilation process in the Pacific Northwest. Painful at first, still painful later, but we're merging in and you can't stop us. Lastly, we will look at the black Chinese robe in the top center of the slide. This robe belonged to Anne Dullion, and though the robe itself is ornate and suited for a woman, it was likely ornamental and not worn based on the lack of wear and creases on the garment. As far as the origin of this robe, it is authentically Chinese, but not an authentic imperial robe. At the end of the imperial dynasty in 1912, many trappings of imperial society were lost overnight, including foot binding, men's pigtails, and the need for the exquisite skill and craftsmanship of making imperial robes. The level of detail and craftsmanship in an imperial robe can be identified by the quality of materials and the skill used in the embroidery, patchwork, and personalized details. Robes of imperial China represent rank, with Gundip and Qinyuk Noi wearing the official necklaces and surcoats with rank badges of the 4th grade of non-military imperial officials in their family photo taken circa 1910. This is going to take me a second. I'll flip so you can see it. And we're going back. This robe was likely stitched together by the skilled and out-of-work tailors and seamstresses that were no longer making imperial robes professionally, and instead making counterfeits for the tourism trade. A surplus of robes and textiles were sold en masse after the fall of the imperial dynasty, and it is not unusual to find those materials repurposed to make new garments. This robe is a perfect example of exactly that. When you have the opportunity to inspect it up close, please pay close attention to how some pieces look more detailed and aged than others, like the collar and lower edges with the white background, or how the hand-stitched embroidery on the main body is impressive, but sometimes inconsistent from other sections or even incomplete. What I find so interesting about this robe is that it comes from a patchwork and impersonation of Chinese culture, made to fool and purchased to impress. Lillian was born in a world that both idealized and scorned her for her differences, and was socially accepted, but only on the surface. So, what makes an American dream? A core theme that comes up often is the concept of social mobility and the belief that anyone is capable of moving up the social ladder. Other themes involve wealth, personal freedom, or having a good family life. Many roads lead in one way or another to economic prosperity, whether in measuring success or creating a legacy. But what happens to the other ideals that contribute to prosperity? Health, friendship, security? The answers to this question and the ideals described will be completely different from one person to the next. Granted, we are in an economic crisis and it costs $10 to buy a banana, but I'm still in a completely different position than my parents were when they immigrated to the US nearly 40 years ago. All we can ever really do is imagine or empathize when trying to understand vastly different experiences from our own. If there's a takeaway from this research, it's that the goal of the American dream and the economic prosperity may very well have been the same for both Lillian and Anne's families when leaving their homes to come here. I think the wealth gained on both sides was from hard work, luck, and perseverance, all of which afforded them a level of comfort and accessibility that they may not have had otherwise. But wait, there's more. But the driver of hope and the core factor that I believe contributed most to their prosperity was a sense of belonging and the positive mental health, friendship, and security that could offer. Lillian was denied opportunities time and time again, but found community in her hobbies and eventually her friendship with Lavina and their animal rescue hideaway on Mercer Island. Her father, Gundip, was offered friendship and kindness by Ella McBride and spent his career offering the same to immigrants in the community. Anne was a part of high society, which I'm sure she enjoyed, but she still chose to be a very public and proud part of the Jewish community, despite lingering prejudice. Now, to wrap this up so we can finally have a bathroom break, many researchers believe that the concept of the American dream is dying out, with younger generations soured by the housing crisis and the out-of-reach consumerist version of a white picket fence American dream. Well, good riddance. What is more important to focus on when considering the importance of the American dream is the definition and relevance of that concept to who you're talking to. What are their experiences like? What boundaries do they face? What would a pair of couture shoes mean to you? And to steal a line from Trevor Noah, what would they mean to someone who was born a crime? What do we know of minority perspectives, and what could our institutions do to better share them? How can we better understand what we haven't experienced? We have witnessed so much discrimination and hate in both history and present day. How can we take our efforts from listening to doing? What have we learned, and how can we grow our capacity to learn more? Focusing back into present, I would like for everyone to take one last moment to just reflect. My questions for you are: what more can we do to expand our community, to embrace what we consider unfamiliar, and to resist complacency? This can be in our lives, our institutions, our friend groups. So I'll just give it like 37 seconds of reflection, and then we'll move on to questions. Also, if anyone would like to share, you're welcome to do that during the question round. So we have a mic that we could pass around for any questions. Feel free to throw up your hand.
I don't mean to hog up the questions and everything, but I can't resist sharing this observation with you. This is not a question, it's an observation, it's a recommendation. We just watched the other night a movie we found that was made, I think, in 1948, with Ingrid Bergman. Was that 1948? Ingrid Bergman became famous when she played a role as this woman in Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart. I think that was 1943. But in 48, she made this incredible movie called The End of Six Happiness. Only a lot of older people would know what that movie is, where she played this missionary who wanted to go to China. She was encouraged not to by the missionary people because it was pre-World War II, before the Japanese invaded Nanking and the trauma and turmoil that erupted. But that is an outstanding movie. It's showing right now. You can get it on Amazon Prime. The End of Six Happiness. The topography, she untied the women's feet. She was anti-Chinese feet, so they have her doing that in opposition to the traditional culture of tying the feet. So Things that you were saying about how the Chinese women, as girls and babies, they tied their feet in order so they can walk with that certain kind of walk. It was really a crippling effect. Just like in Africa, when they had when they would mutilate the women's genitals. So these are also things that have happened historically. But that movie, The End of Sixth Happiness, tells how she rescues a lot of these Chinese kids as the war is coming to China. It's an outstanding movie, and it's right now currently being played on Amazon Prime. The End of Sixth Happiness, Ingrid Bergman. It is a great movie to watch. Okay, I'm out of here.
Thank you. The End of Sixth Happiness. Thank you.
I'm horrified to be speaking into a microphone, but I was wondering what sort of like lasting physical reminders might we have of these women? Like, is Anne's house still standing on Mercer Island? Not that we would be a creeper and drive by. Or like the museum that Gundip bought. Can we, are these still sort of like these reliquaries that we can visit?
Well, I don't know exactly what Lillian's address was on Mercer Island, and so that one's a little bit difficult for me to say, but I believe the Milwaukee Hotel was purchased and reconstructed. I believe it's I'll actually get back to you on that. I'm gonna Google it, but I remember looking into this, and I know it still stands in the International District.
I didn't mean to stump you. Sorry.
Oh no, that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious, as you were doing all the research into these two women, what was most surprising that you found out about them?
I guess the entire process was pretty surprising. I started off just looking at everything in the collection and then narrowing in, but I knew about the Gundip collection and started focusing more on the immigration story, and that started to narrow into Anne Dullian's story as well. And I think essentially every time I dug deeper and I found a little bit more information about their lives, it was just continuously surprising to hear so much about them, because it's going from a two-dimensional idea of a person into like peeking into their lives, and I think it was just a lot more real. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question.
This is on the University of Washington Library site. Milwaukee Hotel, International District, in Seattle, Washington, 1910 to 1911. It was also previously known as the Gundip Young Building. It is still standing, 5 stories. The street address is 668 South King Street. And there's also a Google return that shows that it's apartments now, so I'm not, it does seem to be residences, but I'm not sure if it's apartments or if it's transient lodging.
Well, thank you so much. This is great. You guys should just take turns answering each other's questions.
Linda, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. It was tremendously interesting to see these migration stories side by side. I wanted to ask a question about the objects, obviously. The accession information is obviously often very, very lacking, and that's very frustrating. We don't know very much about why these women gave these objects to the museum. But all the same, I wondered if you could reflect a little bit, having spent this time working with the collection, on why both these women chose dress objects to donate, and why these dress objects, and what you think they wanted to say about their own lives and their families' lives through these objects.
Ooh, that's a good question. I would like to start off by saying that is Rachel. She is incredibly she's an incredible resource. We actually had her come in to look at these robes, as she's a specialist of imperial robes. Well, so your question is, why do I think that they held on to these and donated these objects to the museum? Well, I guess, yeah. Oh man, I think it would be completely different for either. It would be purely based on conjecture, but I think for, let's say, Lillian, I envision that this was a very proud moment for her because she was really embracing her Chinese culture in a time where it was very much difficult to do so. And to have something where she could express herself freely and stand out so much and not care about that and have that piece of her home with her over these years, I think it's something where, had I experienced that, I would also keep that in the closet protected for years and years and years. I still have clothing from high school that I can't fit into, that I just have so many memories with. And as far as why it's textiles or clothing or the headdress or shoes or whatever else, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's easy to pack, it's easy to store. There's also some furnishings that we receive from the Gundip collection, which are a little bit less easy to store, but that would be my impression of these robes, at least. With Anne Dulian, I think it's just that she kind of made it, you know? Like, she had this long journey. She worked incredibly hard, even marrying this man who didn't have any money really to begin with, and they worked up, starting in a segregated area, and built up this incredible business, and were able to afford things from other countries and afford all these things and fit into this society. And I think it's just almost like a little trophy that her hard work came to fruition. Out of curiosity, Rachel, what was your artifact of choice?
With the discussion questions, that's kind of a complicated question. But I gave my husband would say that my entire wardrobe is a museum collection because I tend to hang on to things. I think, we all hang on to clothing that doesn't fit us and is no longer relevant in our lives because it embodies a part of our lives and we find it hard to say goodbye to that. So it would be clothing. It would definitely be clothing.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, Linda. You just mentioned that that there were furnishings that you were also looking at and when trying to select the items that you wanted to do the research on. I'd be curious to know what other types of objects or items you looked at before narrowing your search down to these items. Were there many other things that, or objects and artifacts?
Ooh, it's so hard to say because it was so long ago now. I knew I wanted to at least look at the Gundip collection again. I applied for this fellowship last year as well, and applied with the intention of presenting on the Gundip collection. So that one definitely made an impression on me. To follow through with that, I was essentially just looking through the database, searching for anything that related to the influence of immigrants in Seattle and economic development. So there were like mochi sample kits and different kitchenware and lots of different things from stores and whatever else, but it was so difficult to tie in any sort of narrative. And so I landed on these two women because I could see them. And I wanted to tell personal stories, and it was really important to me that I had someone I could talk about. Yeah. not allowed. He's my partner.
Forgive me, but what would you donate to a museum to represent you?
Oh, that's a good question. I would donate a ring that my mom gave me when I was in my late teens. At first, I thought she was just trying to give me her lesser jewelry because my sister had already claimed a bunch, and so I was a little bit frustrated. But it was this one pearl ring that my dad gave her as their engagement ring, and they eventually traded it out for something else. But it's this beautiful thing where I started to think about it, and I thought about how they both grew up very poor. They grew up on like this tiny little island, and my dad in particular grew up on a tiny fishing village, in a tiny fishing village on an island. And so this pearl represented so much more than just a pearl or like an alternative to a diamond. It was very much tied to their origins, and it was a part of their process, so I would pick that ring. What would you pick, Nick?
A photo of our dogs.
Oh,
I think there's a couple other folks. Okay.
I wanted to get this in because we're wrapping up, I gather. And I thought that those 3 pictures you got up there, that looks like the Terminator, and I thought it was your clothes. And I was wondering, that's Sean Connery, and I don't know who this other guy is, but it was your clothes. Give them to me now. I don't know what the twist of Sean Connery up there and the other guy, so that's all I was curious about. I like that,
I have traditionally for my entire life always included a funny meme or a GIF in a presentation, no matter how serious. And so I thought I would include these here. They're all question related, and I thought it would be nice and light after such a heavy topic.
Okay. I couldn't help when we were talking about the timelines and you were walking us through how their lives fit into the general context. To me, maybe as like a younger student, a lot of history feels ancient, even if it was only 10 years before I was born. If it was before I was born, it's ancient history. Looking at a lot of those dates, though, like my family, my parents, some of them, my brother was alive. Where do you see the immigrant story? What do you think the collection would look like in another 50 years or now? What are the immigrant stories at the MOHAI going to be when the 2043 person gives the talk, I guess?
Well, I guess I can't speak on behalf of MOHAI, but I would like to think that it would be a lot more stories directly from the community. And so instead of it just being like a content developer kind of writing based on history or whatever else, it's actually getting those personal histories from people directly. And I think that's when it becomes more personalized and authentic, and you're not getting it from any sort of biased perspective.
I think we have time for like one more question, if there is one.
As a woman of Southern Korean descent, how will that affect, or will it play into how you would bring mindfulness to the Southern Korean community in Seattle? Or like, you've done an incredible job.
Another presentation?
Highlighting, the history of, Jews and particularly like this fabulous Jewish woman whose life was marked by philanthropy, and this Chinese woman who really held on to her heritage. Would you, moving forward in your work, want to highlight the contribution of Southern Koreans locally? I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you. That was really good. Thank you. Yes, I would absolutely love to focus in on those stories a lot more. I think the biggest obstacle for me is just trying to overcome the residual angst and resistance from my teen years, where I wanted to feel and be very American and kind of push away Korean cultural practices and whatever else. And so I think to begin with, I should probably learn a lot more from my parents, really. Hear more stories, understand more of the context of these things, ask more questions, just be more open, be more curious, and then from there kind of just open my eyes to see the community that's around and then try and see how I can help, because I'm not sure exactly how I will move forward in these practices, but I guess I'll look for space or a place that needs someone and then try and fill it. And that was a great question. Don't be so hard on yourself.
All right. Thank you so much, Linda. This was amazing. Please, everyone, give a huge round of applause.
Thank you.